Hello everyone! So today I am going to be recalling the first episode of SpongeBob, aside from the pilot, and this one is called Tea at the Treedome. And it is the first episode where we see that SpongeBob meets Sandy Cheeks for the first time ever. So, and here I'm going to begin, and I'm doing it all by memory. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more things like this and other random content that I have. And I also wouldn't mind any requests that you guys have for me as well. I'm also willing to do those in the way that Running the Galaxies would, of course. So here we go, and I'm going to begin. It starts off in Jellyfish Fields, okay? So you see all the grass and the beautiful rocks and the beautiful plants, and SpongeBob is just having this other day of just jellyfishing around. And it opens up to seeing this like light purple jellyfish that just swims up through the screen. And we can notice that it has 4 stingers. Now at this point we see this giant rock at this area over here, and SpongeBob just pops up from it, and he takes out a telescope and he brings it up out, and he just looks inside the jellyfish, and he's just fascinated by what he sees, and he goes, wow, 4 stingers. After that he just takes off, puts on glasses that he just takes from his pants on, and he just puts them on there, and he just prepares himself. Oh, and the jellyfish swims around again at that area, and SpongeBob, for some random reason, just comes on down from the sky, even though we saw him behind a rock, and he floats down with his net. So upon that, he just sneaks up and he just tries to snatch that jellyfish, but he just ends up snatching himself instead. And then the jellyfish just flies away at that moment so it doesn't get captured. And he's like, nope, I'm done here with that. All of a sudden, he hears like this groaning sound that kind of sounds like... So he looks in the direction where the sound is coming from, at the edge of the cliff where Jellyfish Fields is. And he sees this giant clam just wrestling with something in there, you know, and we could see kind of like wide arms and gray boots, until, you know, Sandy, as we know her, she starts like wrestling up back and forth with a giant clam, and SpongeBob can see that she's a familiar creature. So he's pondering to himself, where have I seen this before? So at that moment he just takes up this blue book that says Field Guide on the title, and he just flips through the pages for a second. His glasses are still on at this point, so cute. And he just finds the section he's looking for at the left page, and it says land squirrel. That little squirrel's in trouble. And now at this point when he says that, we can see Sandy's just grabbing that giant clam, as powerful as she is, and she just like slams it into the ground a few times until it's stuck there. And then she says, "Take that, you sorry old clam. Y'all need to learn some manners. You're about as ugly as homemade soup." She starts dusting her hands off, and then she walks away. And at this point, at this area there, well, she's like a distance away right here, and the clam is like right over here, and it gets really angry, so it just like tongues itself out of there, and it just flies over and grabs onto her again, and then just closes its mouth on him, and bam, that's it for her in there. And so then SpongeBob is like, oh, look out! But, you know, it's already caught her, right? And then the glasses kind of flew off his head like that. And then SpongeBob is just running off the mountain, and he's like, I'll save you, little squirrel. And he just like does little karate bits there. And he just lands on top of the giant clam at this spot right here. And he has his arms up like this, you know, and he's looking down at him, and he tells him, "You have fought well, giant clam. You must be vanquished." So he just grabs onto those big wild clam lips, and he just tries to pry that open, like, and we can see the mouth is opening a little bit, and he looks down for a brief second. He says, "Hey, I'm actually doing it," which we all know he's really not, but he keeps on opening it. But then we can see that it's actually Sandy just under there, just trying to pry him open too, like, until she finally gets that big hump of a lift, like boom. And then it knocks SpongeBob off into like these plants that have like those big holes. So like 3 plants there that have like holes inside them. He just lands on like a really big one, just boop. He just gets stuck in there head first. So, and she starts fighting the clam again, and then SpongeBob just gets himself out of there like poosh, and then just flies at the clam again. And while the clam's mouth is open with his big fat tongue there, SpongeBob just lands around it and starts wrestling with the tongue. And as soon as, you know, she sees him there and he's looking back at her, but then the clam just like won't, just like ate him up, and Sandy just like thumped down onto the floor. And then she gets up right away because, you know, oh no, another sea creature's in trouble. So she's like, hang on, little square dude. And she like runs up at the clam again. And she starts using karate against that giant clam. So she does her signature saying or whatever, like, hey-ah, and she starts like punching or kicking at the clam, spinning him around, doing a somersault in there somewhere, and making sure that it's knocking off SpongeBob out of his mouth before she just like knocks it off into existence, which is kind of sad because then you hear that giant clam just go. So, and then she's looking at SpongeBob, who's down on the floor like that, and he looks up at her a little surprised and goes, hey, you like karate too. And he gets off from the ground and starts making like his own little karate moves there, like, and he ends up upside down when he looks up at her there, and he goes, what's your name? And then she giggles a little bit and goes, Sandy. And then she kind of like copies a little bit like what he was doing, like, with her own little karate moves there. And then she ends up with saying like, yourself. And then he runs at this little cliff thing and runs up there and then balances himself back until he lands on one of the square edge there on the floor. And he goes, I'm SpongeBob! Boop, land. Sandy looks kind of impressed with him a little bit with the way he's acting and stuff. And, well, she's like a little testy about showing herself off to him just as much as he is because they had this one thing in common with karate. So she goes, well, SpongeBob, and she starts walking up to this giant boulder, and she goes, oh, take a gander at this. And she just uses like a karate hand and just goes, boom, kind of just like touches the rock, and SpongeBob's like, his face is just thinking like, what's going on? Then you kind of hear the boulder like vibrating a little bit before it just like boom, just breaks into like a million bitty pieces and just almost smacks him with it. And he just like turns a little bit and he's like a little surprised, like, wow, like what the heck? So SpongeBob's a little surprised there, you know, after she did all those bitty rocks, and now it was his turn to kind of impress her with his own little bit. And he wants to be manly about himself, so he's like, oh yeah, well watch this. And you think he's gonna do this big old karate thing, and then he just goes and then does his little armpit fart there. And then Sandy just comes back laughing and says, oh, I like you, SpongeBob. Why, we could be tighter than a bark on a tree. And then she just like does a little karate chop on his hand on the square head of his, like, hi, yeah. And then SpongeBob just copies her. And she tells him, of course, tells her, I like you too, Sandy. And then he just goes, hi, and kind of like hits her helmet. And then he's like, oh, ow. And he's kind of curious about it because she's wearing like this big old helmet thing, right? With a suit. So he's like, hey, what's that thing on your head? And then she's practically telling him like, oh, that's my air breathing helmet. And he's like a little curious about it. May I try it on? And she's like, heck no, it's like I needed to breathe. I gotta have my air. So during their conversation, he goes along with what he's saying because, you know, he doesn't want to ruin the whole friendship that they're kind of coming up with here. So he says, you know, me too, even though he doesn't know what air is. And he says, I love air. Air is good. And she's a little peculiar about it, because she's normally like a genius with this kind of stuff, right? She knows that he's a sea creature and needs water. But she's like, no kidding? And then he's like, why, air is my middle name. Can't get enough of that air. And she's like, oh, how about coming for tea and cookies then? And kind of hands him a little map with like the house and the location that he's at. And even though, you know, it's understandable to him, and to us it's like, what the heck is this supposed to mean, and where are we gonna go, right? But he takes it in his hand and he smiles at it. He's really happy that he's made a new friend. He could go to her house, and she pretty much starts walking away and waves at him and says, don't be late. And he goes, see you tomorrow. Even though, I mean, she didn't really say what time he's supposed to be there. I mean, what's late and what's early, right? But we kind of get the shot over with here when they were in Jellyfish Fields, and it kind of cuts to the neighborhood that he lives in, the street, right? And he starts running down the road, and he's like, Patrick! And he's kind of like sun tanning on the top of his house with the rock. And he's got on like these green sunglasses there. And he kind of like raises it up when he sees SpongeBob there. What's there? And he lifts his head up a little bit and he goes, huh? And SpongeBob is just like really excited and intrigued with all this and tells him, I just met this girl. She wears a helmet full of air. And then Patrick, we know how smart he is, right? So he turns around looking like the smartest guy in the world. I mean, he's older than SpongeBob, but that doesn't mean he's smarter. But so he's like, you mean she puts on airs? And SpongeBob doesn't know what the heck air is, so he's like, I guess so. So Patrick keeps talking in this sophisticated voice, right? Because he still thinks that he's smarter than SpongeBob and all that. So he's holding the sunglasses there, and he's like, if you want to be fancy, then hold your pinky up like this. The higher you hold it, the fancier you are. So SpongeBob's just following his advice because he's kind of older than him, so maybe he has more wisdom in this kind of stuff, and, you know, he's kind of his go-to sometimes. So anyways, he holds it up and goes like this, and Patrick tells him, higher. Now that's fancy. They should call you SpongeBob Fancy Pants. After that whole convo, it kind of transitions into Sandy's house. And SpongeBob and Patrick are kind of walking over to the door, and Patrick is just reminding him, you know, I'll help you through this whole thing. So he tells them, you know, when in doubt, pinky out. You can do it, SpongeBob. I'll be watching. And SpongeBob tells him, you know, thanks, pal. So he opens the door for him, and SpongeBob goes in, and then he kind of closes it back for him. So he has flowers in his hands, in case I didn't mention that. And he walks up to the intercom, and he presses it with his free hand, and he's like, here's a hello. And he's like, hi, Sandy, it's me, SpongeBob. And she's like, hold on a sec, I'll let you in. So then he hears like this little beeping alarm and a flashing red light, and he doesn't really care much about it. He's like, whatever, I mean, it's just an alarm flashing. I would wonder why it's flashing, but... And so the water starts sinking and sinking and sinking, and he starts noticing this, and he kind of looks down at the drain as all the water leaves, and he's whistling this whole time. So when the water's all gone, he kind of feels the dryness, and he's like... And he panics and then rushes to the door and knocks like heck, you know? And he's like, Sandy! 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 And she comes in and like she wheels out the door really quick, right? And lets him in. He's like flopping in there like a fish. And she's like, something is wrong. There's no water in here. And he's kind of glancing everywhere, and he sees things that you don't really see underwater, right? Like this giant tree, the grass, a butterfly flying around, and all her other stuff that are in there. And then she smiles at him and says, well, of course there's no water. Nothing but air. So he gets up from the ground, and he kind of like swats in the air. And he like sniffs it a little bit. And he goes, no air? And she goes, that ain't a problem, is it? Hi-ya! She kind of like hi-yas the air a little bit to kind of show how the pressure's kind of a little bit different, right? Like you just hear a and SpongeBob replies to her, problem? Ah! He laughs a little bit and he goes, oh, that's how I like my air. And then he inhales like really, and then smiles there. And then she starts walking away, and then he's like, with no water. And you kind of see that he's like drying out and the heat is like intense over his head a little bit, but he doesn't really want to show it. But Sandy is just like cartwheeling off across the show there, across the screen, excuse me. And she's like, and she goes, oh, all right then. Well, I made Texas tea and cookies. Call right in. And you kind of hear like a little wheelbarrow thing just squeaking, like that squeaking road thing, and he just like comes in like a few steps, and then he's like suffering there in his facial expression, but she doesn't notice it because she's too busy trying to be a good host. And she's like, well, that's not in. He just goes like 1 or 2 steps in, and then she comes right back to him and then grabs his hand and then just pulls him in a little more so that she can come in and stand around closer, you know, to the tree and the where they're gonna have their little picnic there, the little gathering at the bench and the table. And then she's like, oh, you're a funny little dude. I'll give you the grand tour. So we can see the sun is blazing in the sky there and sizzling like, and he's just SpongeBob is just standing next to her near the tree, just suffering. And he's taking it because he just wants to make a new friend here. And she is not making it any easier with the way that she's putting the words out of her mouth. So she's saying, oh, you know, this here is my little bubble. And she says, like, this air is the driest, purest, airiest air in the deep blue sea. And she kind of points off a little bit and she goes, oh, that there's my bird bath. And SpongeBob can clearly see water out in that fountain and a little bird just flapping in there, just taking a bath there. And he's just really focused on that. So he's not caring about what she's saying. There's my oak tree. It provides me with extra air. And this whole dome is made from the strongest polyester name thing, and she says like, that's just a fancy name for plastic, ain't that just the bee's knees? And she's just continuing conversation and SpongeBob's like, and he's like trying to sneak off to the bubble bath. So then when she starts talking about like her wheel or whatever where she exercises to stay fit, he kind of like runs off and goes to the bubble bath and just like soaks up all that water and smashes the bird in there like until the bird just like punches him out, and he ends up back next to him. And for like a split second he's okay, and then he just starts blazing out again and just having that like dry phase and the heat coming out of him. And then Sandy is just looking back at him at that point. And again, she doesn't notice that he's like suffering from all this, so she's like, oh, well, that's enough then. Okay, well, let's have that tea now. So she just goes off to prepare them at the table for the tea, and he's just like, ugh, whenever he, you know, he gets in that face again. And then he hears a little banging on the window, dun, dun, dun. And he looks over and sees Patrick there watching him just like he promised, and he tells him, you know, Pinky, Pinky. And then you can hear like the way his eyes close, like crunchy, and then he kind of like lifts up like a greasy trap like finger and like and just lifts it there. He just doesn't even know what to do. He's just holding the flowers. And you kind of transitions to him sitting down, and he keeps his pinky up and he keeps the flowers in his hands. And while she's just sitting across from him there, he uses the funniest voice, of course, his dried up voice there. He's like, I brought you some flowers. And she's like, oh, for me? How sweet that she goes and grabs onto the flowers and tries to like yank them out of his hands. It kind of knocks off a piece of a finger and it's kind of all rusted up, and he like tries to like wrap his finger up again, and you hear that crunchy sound as he closes it, like, and that's when Sandy's like, what's going on here, right? And she's like, are you okay? And SpongeBob still just wants to keep this tight between them, doesn't want to ruin the friendship, so he's pretty much going, yes, I'm okay. And she kind of continues the conversation going a little bit after that, and she says, you know, you're the first sea creature to ever visit. And then she's pretty much like, I can't imagine why. Can I get you anything? Water would be nice. I'm gonna go put these in a vase, she says, completely dismissing that he wanted water, and I don't know why the heck. I mean, it's just a part of the story, but she just decides, let me just put this on the vase in the water, forget your water. So he's like, take your time. And she kind of walks away with the flowers. As soon as she's out of the screen, he just flees off that chair and starts running like side by side up to the door. He's like, because he's really desperate. He's really desperate for water because he's practically dying right now, right? So he just clings on to the door and he tries to spin it out. And he's like, I gotta get out of here. But then, you know, he starts thinking about the things that happened before, and he feels what Sandy says in his thoughts, and he says, I like you, SpongeBob. We could be tighter than a bark on a tree. So he feels that they can have a genuine relationship. He doesn't want to quit on that. And then Patrick is teaching him how to be a more sophisticated person, to kind of win her over, you know, and impress her. So he feels his thoughts in his head, and it says, when in doubt, pinky out. And so then he lifts up his pinky, and then he just turns around from the door feeling completely motivated, the opposite of from dying. And for a split second, he kind of forgets that he's dying because he has no water. And he says, I'm no quitter. Water is for quitters. I don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need it. And he kind of starts walking back and marching back to the chair until he sits down. I don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need it. After SpongeBob was brave enough to sit back down on that bench, Sandy comes back with the vase full of the flowers, right? And what she says does not help a situation at all, because she's like, aren't these flowers just pretty? They'll survive much longer in nice, ice cold water. And she puts the vase down, and I'm just thinking, well, ain't that just empty? And so then Sandy just continues on with the conversation. Again, she didn't get him water when he asked for it. So he says, tell me about yourself. It must be fascinating being a sea creature. But SpongeBob is just too focused on the drop of water that's coming out of that vase. And you can kind of hear like that window rub as it just like comes down, streaking down there. Looks like really juicy water. And she sees that he's kind of spacing out a little bit. So she goes, SpongeBob? And then she hears like a ding. Ding! Oh, that's the cookies. The cookies are done. So then she goes off and to get the cookies, right? So then SpongeBob is just sitting there with his thoughts and that vase full of water. And he's just thinking to himself. You hear this eerie music as it builds up, and he's just thinking, I don't need it. I don't need it. I definitely don't need it. I don't need it. Then you hear like this big quiet. And suddenly he's screaming, I need it. So he just jumps up onto the table and he grabs that vase. And then Patrick is just banging on the window. No, SpongeBob, no! Pinky! So all he does is just he raises up his pinky, like that's gonna make it any better. He just like starts golfing down that water. After he just takes off the flowers on there. I'm feeling completely hopeless, and he just like failed all of that. After he drank that water, he just couldn't take it anymore. So he starts like, I'm a quitter! And he starts running towards the door and he's screaming, ah! So as Patrick just sees him running towards the door, he comes up through the door and he just runs in through when he opens the door and then shuts it quick before he comes out, and he's like, you can't leave now, you'll blow it. And SpongeBob is just on the floor suffering, so he's like, air is not good, Patrick, air is not good. But Patrick just takes a hold of him and starts walking him back to the bench, and he's like, you're just being shy. Now, as Patrick is walking along with SpongeBob, he's pretty much saying, you know, don't worry, buddy, you're doing fine. I won't let you blow this. And as he keeps on walking, he starts feeling the intensity that SpongeBob was feeling, you know? He starts feeling hot and dry, and, you know, he starts pacing down, slowing down. Eventually, he drops SpongeBob on the floor, and he gets on his knees, and he's just coughing it up there, like... And he like looks around. What's going on here? And he's like, he stands up and he screams, "What kind of place is this?" And he just runs back to the door. "There's no water in here." And then SpongeBob just comes up to help him out. And he's like, "I tried to tell you. We have got to get home." And they start wrestling with the door. He's like, "You're doing it wrong." And Patrick just goes again, we got to get out. And they just both eventually just fall to the floor because it's been too long with them without water, and it's hot and it's dry for them. So they're pretty much literally dying on the floor. So after it's been a little bit, Sandy has no idea what happened, right? But she's just pretty much occupied with the cookies and the tea that she brought. So she's like, "Come and get it. Y'all are gonna like the..." Oh, but then she sees, you know, how SpongeBob is just on the floor dead, because it kind of zooms into where he's at with Patrick, and they look like a real life Sponge and Star there. So she pretty much screams because they're practically dead there. Dun dun dun! So then it just transitions off into, well, you know, how she is actually giving them water, finally. It just transitions to that happy playful music that comes in at the end there, and she's on a ladder, she's got a hose. SpongeBob and Patrick have some sort of like helmet, just like she does, except that she's filling theirs with water one by one so that they can get up. And so she finally fills them up, and they're feeling a lot better. You can tell by their facial expressions. And she comes down the ladder, and she practically announces, "If y'all needed water, you should have asked." And they're looking at each other like, "Yeah, you know, yeah, we should have." That's what they're thinking. After Sandy's assured that they did okay, she brings out the tea, and then she says, "Let's make a new toast to new friends." So she gives them each a teacup, and they try to like drink it up the way she was doing, but they just, you know, it just clashes with the helmet, so it just drips up to the floor. So she grabs her tea, and she takes a little tea leaf thing, and she puts it into each of their helmets there. And it kind of like starts creating the tea with the water that they're in. I mean, basically that's how we make the tea, right? And she says, "Well, I hope you like your tea strong, drink up." And as soon as it starts getting all tea, they just sip the water that they're in there, right? Like, and as they're drinking, you know, Patrick just like taps on his helmet. Dun, dun, dun. He just reminds him to be fancy. So he just holds his pinky up, and then SpongeBob holds his pinky up, and then they just like sip away with the water. And that's the end of that episode. I hope you like that, and I hope that you'll keep watching and subscribe to my channel and make requests. So thank you very much.